Good morning. Ayin Beis, volume 3. We're on page 1243. So yesterday we reviewed the relationship and the impact of both moichin, intellect, on emotions. We're talking about in that whole maturation and growth development process, and as well as the impact of emotions on moichin. So it's becoming apparent that the emotions, when they mature, they give something back to the moichin that leads them to the source of the midas in atik. So till now we've been learning that the moichin, even the yichud zivuk shalim, the complete union of chachma and binah, gazes at the forehead of arich, which in turn draws from the 370 shin ayin of atik, of pnimius atik, but it's still the forehead of arich. The midas are rooted in atik itself, higher than the root of chachma and binah. So in turn, they give something back to the moichin, which is, as in the language of the Torah that I read yesterday from Yisro, that he cites here on line 3 of page 1243, Yafa koyach haben bekoyach ha'av, that the children give something back to the parents. And that is, as he said here, but he has an explained exactly the difference what the midas do and what arich and ampin what Abba ve'ima, chachma and binah themselves do when they gaze at arich. We don't know yet the exact distinctions, but clearly there's something that the midas return and elevate the moichin, like a merkava, a chariot that elevates the one that's riding on the chariot. Okay. And that's shlach tishlach haseim shamidis esim aliyah v'hagba b'bchinas bina. I'm reading now from the 6th line on top of page 1243. The pages can be found at ayinbeis.com. And so he says that's shlach tishlach haseim, that afterward you're sending away the mother. What means sending from the mother, from sitting and hovering over its chicks, its offspring? Now the mother is sending away. The mother should elevate back to its atzmius, the atzmius of binah. Now, we learned this line already, but I'm going to read it now so we can understand the flow. Omnam, however, this aliyah says that amidus hushamidus nechlol b'chinas binah. Why is it a qualification? Because most likely you could say, very simple, the eggs or the chicks in the nest, when you send away the mother, they don't go with the mother. But here, when it comes to the midas, it says the midas are encompassed b'chinas binah. So here, however, the midas are encompassed in binah, even as binah elevates. So I'm not sure if he's making the distinction between the mashal and the nimshal. That the example, that's not exactly the case. That the chicks don't go with binah, whereas in the midas it is. Or he's just saying omnam because he wants to focus that's not this situation, that the midas are encompassed in binah as they elevate, and through that eisim aliyah v'agbo b'chinas binah. But he's going to explain what this means. This is where we stopped, but this is now the explanation. He says, well, lamaila, what is this lamaila in ruchnius? So he's now going to introduce, before I read on, let me just introduce you to yet another Kabbalistic concept, which is also a part of the interface of connecting the higher reality with a lower reality, and that is the issue of Ibbur. Remember, we talked about Ibbur, Yunika Moichin. Ibbur is pregnancy. That's where, in Binah, when it's pregnant, the mother is pregnant and then gives birth. Chachma itself is not the state of pregnancy. Chachma is the spark, the kernel, the seed that provides life. But where is it developed? It's in Binah. And of course, after the child is born, the mother also nurtures the child, which is what we've been discussing here. So in this level of Ibbur, Kabbalah introduces yet another, that there's an Ibbur Rishon and an Ibbur Sheini. In human pregnancy, there's one pregnancy, and that's that. Here, there are actually, in the higher levels, there's 2 stages in pregnancy, Ibbur Rishon and Ibbur Sheini. So we're going to read it inside, and I'll explain what that means, and that's going to be relevant here to our entire discussion in the elevation of the maturation of the midas. So he says like this. So remember, but keep in mind that everything is compared to growth. Just like Odem Eitz HaSoda, he compared it to vegetation. You plant the seed and it grows. That's the comparison to Hagdolas Hamidis. Midas are compared to the growth of vegetation. The second example for growth is pregnancy. A child, first there's the impregnation, there's the conception, there's the development. Then there comes the stages of birth. And as we learned, Yunika, nursing, Ibbur, Yunika, Moichin, and all those stages. So now we're going to go deeper into the level of Ibbur. So he says like this. What is this on the Lamaila, meaning in the higher worlds? This level where the midas are nichlolim in Binah. He says this is a level of Ibbur de Zah, the pregnancy of Zah. Zah, in other words, is contained in the womb, the beten ima, in the womb of Binah. So we're not sure what this means yet, but that's what he says. That means that the midas are now encompassed within Binah. But we know that can be two stages. There's when it's still not born yet, it's also Ibbur inside of Binah. Because the mother is pregnant and gives birth to a child. Here we're talking the midas, after the midas were already born and they're matured, then they elevate Binah again. But not again. They elevate Binah back to its original place. So what is going on here? So he explains like this. In Eitz Chaim, there's a section called Ibburim, which we already referred to earlier. Shari Zivugim, there was Shari Ibburim. Just to give you reference, he spoke about it, I believe, Beis Mini Ibburim, and Shari Ibburim on page 1236. We said that there were two types of Ibburim. One for the purpose of the outer dimension of Zah, and that's the Mokkah, the source from Alochim and the angels and the worlds. And the second for Pnimi Zah, which is the source of souls. Yichud Chitzeni Dava, Yichud Pnimi. So let's see what he's going to say now. Yeah. So he says like this. So it says, Kumeshkosa Beitz Chaim Shari Burim, the B'chdei Sheyeh, Hamshachas Meichen, the godless, the Zah, in order for there to be the transmission of Meichen, the godless, a mature mind in Zah, we're not talking about the birth of the midas. The birth of the midas, we learned that first and they're very natural and behavioral, and then they grow. That's the pregnancy and the birth. But for the Meichen, the godless, which is a higher level of maturity, it is the level of maturity and how it impacts its Zah. For that, the Eitz Chaim says you need to have, here goes the expression, Ibbur Sheini de Zah. Zah has to go through a second pregnancy for this purpose. Basically, a second birthing. One, the first Ibbur Rishon is to create the very emotions that they should emerge even as chicks, as just babies, so to speak, in a very immature and very initial stage. Then as the child grows, well, in this case, the midas grow, they come to a level of higher and higher level. You want Moichin the godless in Zah? Then you need an Ibbur Sheini de Zah. What is this Ibbur Sheini? He says, V'inyan Ibbur Sheini, hu shamidas hen l'mayla metam v'das. Right. This Ibbur Sheini is that the midas now are elevating to a place that's higher than just the midas that are born from pure intelligence. In other words, I'll explain in a moment the concept, but I think we already discussed it. I just want to, let me explain it right now. We learned, as he's going to say in a moment, that the Ibbur Rishon creates emotions. Emotions are born, but they are, that stage, it's like a father and mother giving birth, but the midas are very, very raw, and in their earliest stages, and they're called tivim, he's going to say in a moment. So they're in a very limited state. What is a child's emotions like? Those emotions are about its needs, its survival, and so on. So even though we're going to learn that, we're going to learn that they're rooted in the in Atik, because the Ashrasha is a very natural structure, but at that stage, they're not developed yet. Like we discussed yesterday at length, just because the emotions are rooted in a high level doesn't mean that they've developed and matured. It's, think of it like you could have a tzaddik has a neshama. He's born with a very great neshama, greater than his parents even. Just as an example. But at the stage of childhood, you may see a glimpse of it, but you don't see it in its full developed state. The education of the child through parents and educators, who may even have lower souls than this tzaddik. The Alter Rebbe's, the Neshama Chadosha. It was a greater soul than his teachers and his parents, but at that stage, it's still in early development. So there's the birth of it, meaning it's starting to emerge. As it grows and now is ready to reach a higher level of maturity, then the midas are no longer just the natural wiring. They come to a place where they are now experiencing something higher. As we discussed yesterday, the midas themselves, as deep as they're rooted, but they're still the very structure of your wiring. Moichin is able to absorb a level of elikus that's beyond the midas, that's beyond any midas. So as the mind develops and helps the person grow from personal subjective needs to being absorbed, as we learned, in higher levels of elikus, then it's not just the midas as they are commensurate to the intelligence of the mind. We learned, remember, that the mind develops the emotions and refines them and teaches them to contemplate on the emotions, feeling that your sustenance is dependent on godliness. Chayecha, he's your life and sustenance. He's your father. So the more the mind understands this, the more the emotions relate to godliness, but it's a godliness al pi seichel. It's not yet reaching the place where the midas are rooted in their source, which is higher than seichel. Because the mind, at the end of the day, is a seichel dika process. It's an intelligent process. Yes, the mind is rooted in moichis tima, which is kachol b'machshava, the metzach, the rotzen. But within the rotzen also lies a reason, except we don't know the reason, or it's completely beyond us. So as the mind grows, and at the same time the emotions grow, it helps the emotions get to a place that's beyond its very natural wiring. It comes to reach places that are l'mayla mitam v'das. So let's read it inside and I'll explain further. The Kamosha Ibbur Rishon, just as the first Ibbur, the one that first brought emotions into play in the first place, talking about the early stages of its, and who shamidas ein lamata hadas, the midas then are lamata min hadas. They're just natural instincts, impulses, reflexive, as we discussed. Rag b'bchinas tivim. They're just the natural reflexes. A child, its natural emotions are just its natural reflexes. Lamata midas, it's not driven by das, it's driven by the reflexive, impulsive nature of the emotions. Dahainu, rak mitzad hatva shebenefesh. Meaning at that stage, it's only based on the way it's rooted and seated in the nefesh. Shezeu gamkin rak mitzad etzem nefesh. U'kamosh is bro. That's also due to the etzem nefesh, which is higher than seichel and das. That's correct. How u'kamosh is bro lil arak shezeu kamosh betachlis hakatnus. But they're still right now. They're betachlis hakatnus. They're in utter immature state. So even though they're rooted in the etzem nefesh, and that's how they're rooted and they're seated there, but at this stage, in this child stage, as I said before, even the biggest tzaddik, who would be the biggest gone, when he's a baby, a newborn baby, you don't see that in any revealed way, even if there's a glimpse. Because b'poel mamish, all you see is the natural reflexes and instincts of this. This is Ibbur Rishon. They're not even in a state of a midah, an emotion like we spoke, like a child. When a child cries for its milk, or a child isn't crying because it's tired, you can't even call that an emotion. You call that the state of Ibbur, Yanika Moichin. You call that mutva, not murgish. Murgish is when there's a conscious feeling where a child has some sense of recognition. This is completely reflexive and behavioral. So you can even call it mitzias midah adayin. And though the midas then in that lower state, that earlier stage, are very intense, And the best proof is, you can't stop a child from crying because the emotions are just expressed and the reflexes are very untamed and very intense. But then you still cannot call them like the midah of chesed. A child does not show the midah of chesed love. It's all reflexive. You can't call it yet a faculty that's being revealed from the nefesh. You could just say, this is the natural, instinctive, and reflexive, impulsive behavior of this nefesh. That's what he says. All it is a revelation of the very nature and the root-seatedness of this human being. But there's no developed emotion that you can even talk about. Like an animal. That you can't say an animal has midas in the full sense of the word, a developed emotion. All you have is the intensity of its natural sense. So for example, an animal is drawn to another animal in order to breed, or an animal is drawn to protect its children, or you see other elements of an animal being either aggressive or being loving and kind. He's saying here, you don't call that a midah. You call that the intensity of its very nature. In other words, it's a reflexive midah. It's not a deliberate one. It's not like the animal worked on itself to contemplate and say, this is a midah I should have right now. The way the natural animal is born, God created it with natural reflexes. That's what he's calling here hatfa, teva, b'chinas tivim. You can't call it a defined emotion as in a deliberate emotion, the way I'm translating it. It's a reflexive, impulsive emotion, which he's not calling really a midah, like he says. It's the teikef hateva shalosh ein ze b'chinas midah. So that's in Ibbur Rishon. So basically what we're saying here is that even though these midas are rooted in a very high level, but right now, practically speaking, these midas are just the pure reflexes of a child in its early stages. So just as it is there, when it's talking about the midas salamata min hadas, kamoi came b'chinas Ibbur Sheini, so too it is in the second Ibbur, which is when the Ibbur of the midas as they get encompassed in Binah, meaning now we're talking about mature emotions, not emotions of a newborn, but emotions that are now developed and been trained and guided by intelligence. So it's an intelligent emotion. But you want it to have also meichin de gadlus. He says, "Hu gamkin lo al pi hatam." It also is not based on pure reason. Ki mitzad hashrasha shebenefesh kanal. It's also due to the hashrasha shebenefesh, the way it's seated in the nefesh. Okay, this needs explanation. Let me continue reading and I'll explain in a moment. Rakshazehu gadlus hamidah shi lamayla mitam vadas. Now we're talking already the godless hamidah, a mature emotion that's higher than tam vadas, not beneath tam vadas, but higher. This is the ava b'chol meidecha, with all your might, with all your all, which is an ava bilti migdal, a love that is not limited. A bitl mitzvah is that the emotion is completely nullified and its entire personality is nullified in this process. Okay. Before I read, let me explain what he's saying here. So, it's very, very brief and dense, so it definitely needs explanation because it seems even to contradict itself. What's going on here? So, there's two aspects I think we need to understand about midas. On one hand, when you say seichel, for instance, even though a human being is created with intelligence, even a newborn child has a brain, a mind, but intelligence is far more subject to growth. What does that mean? That in a child, the intelligence is still a small mind, so the mind is not yet developed. As we grow, the mind becomes more and more developed and grows and matures and becomes a smarter person, basically, a more seasoned person, a developed mind, a mature mind. Like we learned, he mentioned Ayin Beis, that seichel So even though seichel is part of the nefesh, but its primary way of growth is through giluyim, meaning it grows first the seichel understands lesser things, then greater things and greater things. Midas are very different. Midas is the natural instincts that a person has. Now they can be very immature or they can be very mature. In the mind, you have a mind that is a smaller mind, understands things less. But since it's not based on impulse and reflexes, so basically the mind is not revealed yet. With emotions, you can have a state because it's the very nature of our wiring. So if there was no training and no education, the mind, a human 20-year-old who's just following every whim they have, and they're completely impulsive and completely reflexive. That's like basically ignoring the mind. Whatever comes your way that attracts you, you're drawn to. There's no discipline. With the mind on its own, without the emotions, you could say the mind is not yet developed, but you can't say it's undisciplined because the mind doesn't have any natural instincts. The mind is a pure, intelligent entity that's based on understanding things and evaluating and so on. So the emotions have these two different stages. In its earliest stage, it is just like a sapling. It just grows, and like you said with the behemoth, it just goes by its reflexes. As the mind grows, the mind begins to guide these emotions. And the emotions start getting a personality, an emotion. You tell a child, you don't just cry, you don't just grab. Here, you ask and say, please, thank you. So the child's emotions are being trained by the mind to be more disciplined and more tamed. That's in the early stages what we call mutfa and murgish, till bar mitzvah. Then comes the level of gadlus hameichin. Gadlus hameichin is when the person is able to get beyond subjective interests. Till now, you're training the child, don't grab the food, say please. But it's still a food. The child is still driven by its natural desires, its natural survival. As we learned earlier, chayecha, this is my life. It's all about me. However, I'm doing it in a more disciplined way. Then there comes a point where the mind introduces into the human being higher consciousness, that God is beyond you. It's not all about your interests. You start learning about things that are not about your subjective reality. As we learned, what is real muskul? There are stages. First, you think about godliness that's beyond existence, but it still relates. Then we think about godliness that's completely beyond. That means you're thinking about realities that are completely outside of you. The mind is able to explore that. The emotions don't have any guide and direction to get there without the mind. Even though the emotions are rooted in a higher place, but the way they manifest is like a growing tree. They need to grow to come to appreciate higher states of consciousness. So now when you get to a point where the mind is ready to introduce the emotions that till now were more immature or more around self-sustenance and self-interest, so now the emotions start saying, oh, wow, there's a God that's beyond me. And it starts being drawn. Remember, I spoke yesterday that the emotions have something the mind doesn't have, experience. It feels things in a very internal and an integrated way. The mind is almost like the teacher within you. Like you're the child, the emotions are the children. The ima, the mother, and the father are the teachers that are training the emotions that now you can experience something completely outside of your own subjectivity and your own interests. So now the emotions are now being subsumed and absorbed within the moichin. And as such, the emotions are now no longer guided only by its needs, but now the emotions have grown to a point that they're still they're still the seated emotions that you began with, because that's how you were born with, but their focus is not on self-interest. It's focused on godliness that's completely beyond itself. In the words he just said, that it's now that the Ibbur Sheini is gadlus hamida l'mayla metam v'das ava b'chol meidecha. It's completely ready to sublimate itself. Now, emotions by nature are subjective. For emotion to say, I am ready to dissolve and be absorbed in a reality greater, bittul v'mitzias, b'chol meidecha, and completely my whole mahus should change, is a very big thing. Because emotions on their own are subjective interests. So basically, the hashrasha of the midas in Atik that he said earlier can manifest in two ways. It can manifest in a way where it's all about you. It's still rooted because it's rooted in a very high place, but the emotions are not aware of that. Or the mind can train the emotions, so the emotions remain rooted in Atik, but now they are also experiencing something beyond their own interests. In other words, the emotions are actually experiencing something that is opposite of the natural state of emotions. So this doesn't change the hashrasha. It's still rooted in Atik. The question is only how it manifests. So even if a child's emotions, even an emotion of a person who doesn't let their mind guide them, the emotions are still part of the very core of who you are, your core personality. But they have not been guided to be directed in the right place. The moichin directs them, and then when they do, the midas in turn reveal their atzmizdik connection all the way to the highest level. He didn't state that yet, but that looks like where he's going with this. So that's how I understand this piece. And it must have explanation, because without explanation, this is completely cryptic. I would, before I stop for questions, I want to read till the end of the paragraph of this, because I think it's vital to understand. So now he's saying, so with the comparison he's making here is like this. So just like in Ibbur Rishon, when the emotions just emerged, like a newborn, immature, childish emotions, they're lamata min hadas, that's what he said, because it's completely reflexive. It's not based on intelligence. It's not based, nothing is guiding it. Then there's the stage where the emotions are guided by seichel. Then when you want the godless meichin into the midas, in order for the midas to have what he calls godless hameichin, I'm just looking at the language, the godless bezah, like this, the godless bezah. Now you want the midas to come to a place that's even beyond their natural instincts. In other words, stage one is completely natural, below seichel, reflexive. Stage two, the emotions are guided by seichel. Now you want them to reach a place that is moichin the godless, which is where being absorbed by a reality that's greater than their interests. There you also need l'mayla mitam v'das. That's the comparison. It's also not al pi atam, because al pi atam, the emotions should only want things that serve their interest. So this is godless amidah l'mayla mitam v'das. So now the midah has reached a place that's beyond its natural structure, and that's ava b'chol meidecha, that it's ready to completely change its personality in the pursuit and the love and awe of godliness. So the emotions are in effect, but they're no longer the way they are in their raw immature state. Because the love and the yearning and longing is in the depths and the innermost part of the nefesh, of the spirit. So you could have it, and it's completely nullified and sublimated its personality in this longing. So you could have a midah like ava that's completely reflexive. I'm hungry, I eat. You could have a midah that's guided, but it's still about itself. So it makes a bracha on the food. It eats kosher food. It says, thank you, please. But it's still in its own mahus. It's only that now it's done in a disciplined way. Al pitam v'das. And then you can have that the mind has trained the love, the real love. Why would I love a steak or something that's just delicious in the physical world? I want to love reality itself, this higher state of godliness. And now the love of this ava v'yira, of the natural emotions of the human being, have become essentially emotions that are drawn to. Instead of loving physicality, it loves spirituality. Instead of loving the material mundane, it loves transcendence. And it's drawn to the point that the midah goes against its own very subjective interest, or you can put it differently, that the subjectivity of the emotion recognizes that the greatest thing it could serve itself is by becoming sublimated and one with something greater than itself. So the midas also appreciate that, not just the mind. Ukamoi. Megav dechika. The dechima as it is gameh. We learned this before.
Migoy.
Goy. Do. The chika, the dechima means that when a person is in love, they become very concentrated, very what's the word I want to use? The stress of love, azidas garmei, causes the person to become completely nullified. When you're in very deep passion or deep longing, in love for something, so you become completely nullified within yourself. That's what love does. Now, love can be directed toward wrong things, and then you become completely consumed with the negative. But if it's driven into godliness, it creates ultimate bittul. That's what he's saying here. We learned this before. I'm trying to remember where. I think in volume 2. From Isaiah. This is Isaiah. Huh? What?
We learned before. I also remember, but I don't remember exactly where.
I think it's a volume 2. I have to find it. Now we're talking about the inner core of the heart. The nekuda hi lelesba chivra hanishein ba ispashtus. Chivra.
Chivra is light, maybe.
Light or whiteness. It has no color.
Shine.
The nekuda hi lesba chivra. It has no glow, maybe. Hainu she'ein ba ispashtus. It doesn't have any extension or expression. Kim bitl kol atzmusa ad shehi kenekuda achas. It's a bitl of the entire core is nullified, is sublimated to the point it's like a nekuda achas. I recall that we learned that it's like when somebody curls up, when they get so consumed with love that they curl up like into one nekuda. You completely lose yourself. In the mimer, the beard in the mimer that says that you shall lift your rod. These are maimorim. I'm assuming they're maimorim in Likutei Torah or Tzemach Tzedek. The Zel B'chinas Ibbur Sheini. This is the level of the second pregnancy. Shehu Iskalus Amidas Bebina. This is the encompassing of the midas in Binah. Vayidezehu Aliyas Habina. And this in turn causes also the elevation of Binah, as we said, to the Atzmius, back to the source. Okay, the example I would give for this is when we learned about Kitsenis Alev and Primis Alev. Basically, human emotions can either be the force that drives us toward our subjective needs, even if they're not prohibited, but they're still our interest, or you can actually awaken and stimulate the emotions to love God, which is what he's talking about here. So, in a true maturity process, the emotions ultimately are transformed. Instead of just being seeking and being drawn to their emotional subjective needs, they're being drawn through the contemplation. They become consumed, and they become like in the Ibbur, like in a state of pregnancy. But this is not the pregnancy of the birthing of these emotions. This is the pregnancy of the maturation and the growth of the emotions, that they too become absorbed in the experience. So if someone's, let's say, staring at one of the 7 wonders, or a beautiful sight in nature, or you're reading a book, I'm just using a practical example, and you get consumed with it. You're so absorbed, you don't even realize you're reading. It's not just your mind is absorbed and you're ignoring your emotions. Your emotions are also absorbed. You can read a book and you can start crying. You can start laughing. You can have actual feelings, but your feelings are not driven by you, that I'm hungry or thirsty or I need something. It's being directed and guided by what you're reading. The story you're reading that you have now become absorbed in is actually impacting your emotions, and you are nullifying them from your own interest. They're becoming nullified and absorbed in this higher experience that you're relating to. So if you can now apply that to godliness, that if you contemplate on Hashem and on the highest levels of Mala Kalam and Seviv Kalam and Kula Kameh, Kala Chashiv, that everything is nullified before him, your emotions can also become absorbed by it, and the emotions are now in this state that he's calling Bittul Kolatz Musa. And that is the Chiddush, because the emotions are there being changed by this process. They're not no longer just following their wiring. So though the emotions in both stages, the early stage, are all rooted in that Etzem HaNefesh, but it's very different based on experience that it has, based on the guidance of the mind. So again, there are three levels here clearly. Emotions Lamata Medas, emotions Al Pitam Vedas, which he discussed earlier, and emotions Lamayla Metam Vedas, B'chol Ma'idecha, where the love and the awe are all becoming absorbed by something greater. That means the Zah is inside Binah. That's Ibbur Sheini. The Zah is now encompassed within Binah, within the comprehension of Binah. And remember, we're talking Binah now, and it's atzmius, not as it's guiding the emotions. When the Binah is revetzes ala frechim, ima revetzes ala frechim, when it's hovering over its shakes, then it's guiding the emotions, stage 2. It's training them. But then it comes to shlach tishlach hasa'im, Binah goes to its atzmius, and the midas are encompassed in that, and in the process elevating Binah as well. So everything is elevated now, not in the amshach, like the sus riding downward and drawing down its comprehension into emotions. It's now the elevation of Binah into its atzmis, where it aligns with chachma, and the midas are part of this whole process. So the whole human being is being uplifted. And there's no question that when a person is emotionally consumed, you can listen to the Rebbe by Farbrengen, and your mind is very stimulated. That's great. But your emotions are detached. You don't feel it. But imagine you also feel the experience. That whatever you're understanding is also an emotional experience as you are listening to the Rebbe. That's a far deeper, higher elevation, because all of you then, in the state, all of you get sublimated in this higher experience. By Matan Torah, they didn't just hear the Torah. They didn't just hear the Aseres HaDibros. Parcha Nishmasan. I'll call Ibbur because their whole being was consumed by it. They saw and heard, and their whole being, including their very existence, was all consumed by something greater. What still needs explanation is what exactly means the hashirasha, the rootedness and the seeding of this midas in the core of the soul. What exactly that means? I explained it partially yesterday, but I still feel needs more discussion in this context. But this is what concludes the paragraphs. I'll stop here for any questions or clarification. As you see, this is not it's not a simple matter. It's pretty complicated, but I think I did some justice to it, but we'll definitely do more. And as you see from the next paragraph, he's not over with it. He's going to ask now, what's the connection of B'chol Moedcha to Binah? If Binah is comprehension and understanding, how do we suddenly get to L'mayla Metam V'das? So there's more to go in this whole conversation, in the Maimer itself, and I'm sure it's going to get clearer as we go along. But now, he's introduced now a new level of understanding of this whole maturity process. Go ahead.
This is exactly what it's bothering me. The Ashosha, everything is explained beautiful, but why can't you say, why in Chochmah you cannot say that it's not mushrash like Midas? Because you're saying it's detached, but when you have Chochmah, it makes you more inner core is more involved in it. Why is Midas reaching you higher than Chochmah?
I already explained it. That to me is very clear. That is not even a question in my mind. I explained it yesterday, the bottom of page 1242. Did you look in the Torah that I taught? Because Seichel is not the Etzem HaNefesh. It's not how you root it. Seichel is a tool. It's a koyach. Koyach HaMaskil called over Seichel. It's a koyach. It's a faculty. It's not the very personality of the human being. The human being is defined by personality. Personality is midas, not Seichel.
Would you say it about to the Milo also?
Yeah. What do you mean? The Zohar says, Zoh, Batika, Ochid, Vitalia, and Chochmah Binah is in Arich, in Meiches Timo. It's a rule in everything. I gave 10 examples. I gave so many examples.
I know, but still,
The yesh is mushrish and atzmus. Seichel is giluyim. Giluyim is not mushrish and etzem. Giluyim is mushrish in the shadish giluyim. It's like the difference between the oyer and the kav and the rishimu. Between oyers and kalim. Seichel is oyer. Midas is like kalim. Let's call it that. So seichel is rooted in oyer, in the mokar agilui. Midas is mushrish in the etzem that allows it to be a keli. That's the nekudas advarim.
Is it fair to say that the midos are what make us independent of the Eibishter? What's confused, as opposed to the moichin, there's a, the chelak elakam mamish. So the midos are giving us our substance, independent, so to speak, of God. Whereas the mochin, in some sense, are a faculty that's more attached to the etzem. Or what's also bothering me, similar to Rabbi Teichel, it's a little bit different. It's the opposite. It's why are the midos, on the one hand, rooted higher than mochin, but on the other hand, they come out, they manifest themselves in such a lowly way, and they have to be essentially developed and brought to a place where they're essentially not even themselves anymore. They're absorbed in elokus, and it seems like if they're the essence of our nefesh, so why does it take so much work to countervail them, if you will, to subdue them and harness them and bring them into a locus, which is essentially enveloping them in mochin. So at the highest level, they're actually behaving counter to their own nature. So it's sort of counterintuitive.
Well, when you could ask the same question about this whole I spoke yesterday about dira b'tachtenim. God desires a home in this lowest of worlds, where it goes. This world says, I exist and I ignore God. So it's also counter. You're taking a yesh, whose whole is complete, godliness is concealed from it, and that's exactly what God wants. That instead of following our subjective interests and me, the ego, that this material world where godliness is most concealed should actually become a home for godliness. So midas work perfectly. The midas are rooted in the highest levels, but in practicality, they come down to a place where they begin with a very immature state of subjective interests. And look at the world. Most people are driven by their emotions, and their emotions are not driving them toward God. So to take emotions and guide them toward and direct them toward godliness is exactly the chiddush of dira b'tachtenim. This is exactly what God wants.
That's the whole life's work.
Exactly. That's precisely what we want. If the midas were revealed godliness, moichin, in this sense, is more like the neshama, and midas are like the guf. Not exactly, but that's why I explained that yesterday. Look, I'm happy to explain this 100 times if necessary, but I definitely advise to go over the classes yesterday and the one before, because I addressed this and make those comparisons. It's going to take time to assimilate these ideas. They're speaking in the level of moichin and midas, but they are dense ideas. If they're learning it for the first time, it takes many times to really get there. That's why I'm giving these examples of how it works.
This is very powerful, but the concept moyach shalit al alev is getting here a little bit a different twist.
Well, I discussed that as well. Moyach shalit al alev is where moichin is guiding the midas, the first part of Tanya. Then I said, then there's the next part, the Ava Misuteres that were wired within us. Moyach shalit al alev is necessary because you don't have a discipline and education and maturity without moyach shalit al alev. The mind has to guide the emotions and train them. Like even on a basic level, to teach a child to say please and thank you, that's moyach shalit al alev, basically. And then there's higher levels of moyach shalit al alev. And then there's levels where the lev is reaching a place of the moyach itself, where it can experience something beyond its own interest. Yeah, to get a person of self-interest, driven by self-interest, that the self-interest should become absorbed by godliness, that's the ultimate goal.
That does help explain things. it essentially sets up our avoida for our lives.
Yeah, yeah.
The line, Rabbi Jacobson, where it says, "Bilti mugbelas v'vichidas bitul b'mitzias b'mishbato b'mohusos lagamre." When midos, the lower levels of midos, go have this aliyah after these three stages that you said that where they involve the mutba and then morgush and then godless. Isn't it really they're going back to their mohus? Why would you say? Maybe you could say bittul mitzias of the lower level of midos being mabattled in its shorish, which is in atika, but why would you say bittul mahus? Isn't it true mahus of those midas in atika as its shorish?
Well, mahus here he means its natural way it was created to be driven by self-interest. That's what he means. Mahus.
Oh, I see.
He doesn't mean mahus in the sherish. He means mahus in its personality. In other words, if let's say you're driven by, let's say your personality is to be very ambitious and to be successful, and then you are touched by godliness, and suddenly all your natural instincts and everything are completely consumed with something greater. And on the contrary, so that's an example that what he means by bitla mahus. I'm going to discuss this more tomorrow for sure. We're going to make it a little shorter. I'm going to end this class now, the end of the paragraph on page 1243. I'm happy to continue this tomorrow. We'll discuss more. I just need to do something. So if you don't mind, I will end here at the end of this paragraph. And